Hey all, so another war vid here. This is a relatively short one, and that's actually in part because there's an Immortal Abomination fight later on in this path, which forced me to bring a poison immune, but that allowed me to bring She-Hulk, and because of her synergy with Mr. Fantastic and the fact that I'm only using Science Champions this war, it just dramatically speeds up all of my fights because my opponents are going to be melting themselves every time they throw a special. So first up we have Doom. You guys have seen Reed versus Doom quite a bit now. You know why it's one of my favorite matchups. It turns off his aura. It eventually reduces and then reverses his willpower healing so that you don't have to worry about how tanky Doom is or getting through his crit resistance because he's just draining constantly from willpower instead of healing constantly from it. It means that even if I mess up the L1 evade like that, his special attack is hitting for pennies of damage. And with She-Hulk, every time he throws one in the first place, he's eating that power sting. I mean, this is just the only downside to using Reed against Doctor Doom is that you're going to want to take some block damage because you're going to parry to reset those. Not the smoothest instance of this particular matchup I've ever had, but this also isn't the hardest node for Doom, especially with Reed, so it works out pretty nicely. This could have gone a little bit better if I had waited longer to throw that special one, just so that it would have been safer to get the debuffs off for the next fight. But I'm pretty sure I was able to launch it before the fight ended and get those debuffs up right before we KO'd Doom, and so I believe I do get credit for them, and we'll see that on this next fight. Yeah, we start with 7. So we had to have gotten a fair number back. Now, Bishop is kind of a weird one. He is going to get buffed, and his buff would make it a pretty bad idea to fight him with Reed. But because that hasn't happened yet, this is still doable. I did some duels, and I'm fully expecting... I'm hoping to get to a special 2, basically off the strength of the Careful Study passive. I'm hoping that he's going to throw 3 special 1s, and then that's going to give me enough power gain to bypass the Power Alternator node and get to a special 2. And then I'm going to, stack that Suppression, stack that Petrify, and calm down both Power Alternator and just see fewer specials from him in the first place. So that'll be helpful. And it's possible, honestly, that Reed could do this fight even after the buff, as long as he gets those debuff siphoners stacked against Bishop, which is tough on this particular node, but could be possible elsewhere, because he'd eventually be cutting the strength of the Incinerates Bishop is going to apply by 75%. Either way, not our main point here. Biggest risk of this matchup is the block damage from Bishop's steady release. That's why I am going for intercepts where I can, but I'm going to need to land at least a couple parries because there's no way I'm going to end up like heavy countering Bishop's specials, right? So I just need to make sure that I land those heavies after the parry. I was clearly slow on that first one off of Limber. Bit of a bummer, but it is what it is. I was not coming into this planning to throw L1s because, as you saw there, they inflict an Incinerate and give him some prowess. But it's looking like he's not going to let me get to an L2. And so to make sure that I max out my debuffs and I'm keeping my damage up and that I'm just not feeding him a ton of specials from the Power Alternator, I decided to go ahead and just throw the L1 because I wasn't too worried about prowess increasing his special damage when I was already nerfing it by 75%. Not an ideal matchup, but I knew that I could get through it, and I wasn't using Reed again. So here we use all 3 of the pre-fights from Reed, because I was saving Torch's pre-fight for later, so the debuff Siphoner boosts his Incinerates, the Suppression means Dormammu's gaining less power, and the Petrify, I'm not planning to trigger Dex at all in this fight, because it would be immediately nullified and probably trigger an ugly degen. But Dormammu will trigger backup recovery when he gets to 50%, and the Petrify just keeps that under control. That's really the only purpose of that. You'll notice that throughout this fight, I'm doing something that I get asked a lot of questions about. which is that I am whiffing a light attack after my heavies. I do that because I think that against certain champions especially, it significantly improves the odds of the AI thinking that you're vulnerable because you started a combo and throwing a special. It doesn't always work, but two of the champions that I've found it most reliable against are in baiting Dormammu and Mojo's L1. And both of those are very important specials to bait against those two champions. So I feel like it kept that fight fast-paced, and that just allowed me to nuke him down with Torch without ever triggering degen. And without losing all that much health, because he never got to an L2, in part thanks to the suppression and the petrify. So Sasquatch, I only threw down a suppression, because Torch is going to deal with his healing, so I'm not worried about it. And power gain could be an issue with high MD, but it usually isn't for me here as long as I use the pre-fight. Now, I shouldn't have parried that because there was a chance to stun, and that was just not smart. But I did out of instinct, and I didn't get punished for it. Now I'm going to dodge this one. We'll see that he doesn't have a lot in MD. If he did, then I would basically just be baiting more L2s than L1s. I've done that before, but that's the advantage of Power Reserve, is that I'm always going to have a special 2, and as long as I keep that in my back pocket, I know from experience that you can survive a couple L3s on that node, as long as you don't get stunned and eat like an L2, which crits. I think that's pretty much the only way I've died there. So we had plenty of room to maneuver there. So now we have Abomination on this updated node, Rise to Power, where when you knock him down, which we are going to do because it's Spite and I'm going to want to keep the Petrify from Mr. Fantastic refreshed, when we knock him down, we're just not going to let him hit into our block for a little bit. And that's all that matters there. Every debuff that we apply to him, including the poisons he applies to himself, will trigger a Power Sting. Notice we did the whiff after the heavy there, and he immediately threw the L1. But like I said, every debuff applied to him is going to apply a Power Sting. We're reducing the healing from willpower. We're healing from willpower until we purify it from She-Hulk Sig. And you can see that while this could be a kind of ugly node with somebody else, because he might trigger Spite, refuse to throw it, you'd have to worry about the poisons maybe, and he might start just throwing a bunch of L2s into your block. She-Hulk has this completely under control. Now, you could play this without Reed and rely on She-Hulk's own Petrify to reverse the power gain, but that means building to the L2 and not throwing the L1s, and therefore not getting both extra debuffs to fuel power stings and not getting extra furies to build her own taunt. The first special or two, I felt like the whiff after the heavy was important, but after that it became a lot less important because her own built-in taunt was keeping him aggressive, and then the fight was easy from there. A reminder that She-Hulk's Furies last longer against extra-large champions, and thus it's easier to stack them, and that makes her really good at her kind of soft power control against large champions like that. So really just a perfect counter. So now that I'm done gushing about She-Hulk, because she's one of my favorite champions and I just never get to bring her to war anymore, let's take a look at this Maw fight. So I used 2 pre-fights again, Suppression and Petrified, just to keep his power under control, because Petrified does apply to Kinetic Transference, as well as Mystic Dispersion. I knew from duels and the fact that I wasn't going to have perfect control over his power gain, that there was basically no chance I was going to keep him from throwing 2 L1s close enough to each other for him to nullify the Fury from the first and therefore to degen me. So I just didn't worry about that. I knew I was going to take some damage from the altitude charges somewhere in here, but my goal was to minimize it. And if I couldn't get him to or if I couldn't get him stunned enough to keep him from being focused, that's why I practiced the spacing on the heavy counter. But basically, I knew that I was going to take a little bit of altitude damage. I was going to take one degen, and my plan was that that was it. Between the power stings, the pre-fights, and Torch being Torch, he'd be down after that. And it worked out pretty well. So I really enjoyed this war. This was kind of a smaller path than I take, and I didn't take some other fights that I normally take. But it was really fun to bring this team. I've said before I really like using Reed and Torch together, but bringing She-Hulk and basically supercharging all three of them was just fantastic. No pun intended, although appropriate. Anyway, this war went pretty well. We didn't get another donut because there was a miscommunication about the global, but we did get another 164. So BG3 is stepping back into our groove from last season and hopefully improving from there. And we were able to win this one, so we're starting to climb back up the ranks. This season has been a little unfortunate so far. I've shared my thoughts on that before, but here's hoping that it ends up in a better place. Hope y'alls are going well. I know we're not the only ones having a rough start. But until next time, take care.